The wedding planner's voice on the phone was polite, almost apologetic. "Ma'am, the remaining balance for your brother's wedding reception is $26,000. How would you like to take care of that today?" For a moment I honestly thought she had the wrong number. I was sitting at my small kitchen table in Raleigh, North Carolina, early morning sunlight coming through the window, my coffee still steaming in front of me. My phone was on speaker and the words she'd just said hung in the air like something unreal. $26,000. For a wedding I hadn't even been allowed to attend. I took a slow breath and asked the only question that made sense. "Ma'am," I said gently, "why would you think I'm paying for my brother's wedding?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well," she said carefully, "your name is listed as the financial guarantor on the reception contract." And just like that, the memory of that night came rushing back. The vineyard, the string lights, my parents standing in front of the entrance like gatekeepers, and my mother's voice saying the words I still couldn't quite believe she'd said. "Only family is allowed inside, you weren't invited." 3 days earlier I had believed I was doing something good. I'm 62 years old now, and after a lifetime of work I try to keep my life simple. I live alone in a modest one-story house in Raleigh, not far from the VA hospital, where I volunteer twice a week helping older veterans navigate paperwork and appointments. It's quiet here. Most mornings start the same way. Coffee, the local news on the radio, a short walk around the neighborhood if the weather's decent. But that week had been different. Because my younger brother Daniel was getting married. Daniel is 8 years younger than me. Growing up, he was the one my parents always worried about the most, the one who needed extra help, extra encouragement, extra chances. I was the opposite. The dependable one. At 18, I joined the Navy and spent 25 years in service before retiring. My parents were proud in their own quiet way, but I always had the sense that Daniel was the one they felt closest to. Still, family is family. And when I heard about the wedding, I figured it was time to show up. I called my volunteer coordinator and asked for a few days off. "I'm heading up to Ohio," I told her. "My brother's getting married." She laughed warmly. "Well, Margaret, that sounds like a good reason for a road trip." And it was. The drive from Raleigh to Columbus takes about 8 hours if traffic behaves, and I've always liked long drives. Gives you time to think. I left early that Thursday morning with a small overnight bag and a neatly wrapped wedding gift sitting on the passenger seat. Inside the box was a set of simple crystal glasses. Nothing extravagant, but something nice, something practical, something that might last. The closer I got to Ohio, the more I found myself remembering the old days. Our childhood house. Sunday dinners. My mother humming while she cooked. Life had been simpler back then, before people grew up and drifted apart. By late afternoon, I reached the vineyard where the wedding was being held. It was the kind of place you see in magazines, now rolling green fields, rows of grapevines, and a barn-style reception hall decorated with white lights. Cars lined the gravel driveway. Guests were dressed nicely, laughing, taking photos near the entrance. For a moment, standing there with my gift in my hands, I actually felt hopeful. Maybe this was the moment things would start to feel normal again. I walked toward the entrance. And that's when I saw my parents. They were standing just outside the doors, greeting guests as they arrived. My father spotted me first. His smile faded. Then my mother turned around. The look on her face wasn't anger. It was something worse. Embarrassment. She walked toward me quickly, lowering her voice. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" I blinked, confused. "What do you mean I came for the wedding?" She glanced over her shoulder toward the entrance. "Only family is allowed inside?" I almost laughed. "Mom," I said gently, "I am family." She hesitated. Then she said the words I'll never forget. "You weren't invited." I remember the way the sounds around me suddenly felt distant. Guests walking past. Music playing inside the hall. Someone popping open a bottle of champagne somewhere nearby. "You're serious?" I asked. My father stepped forward, then his expression tight. "Margaret, we didn't think you'd actually come." I looked from one of them to the other. "Daniel knows I'm here." My mother sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "He has a lot going on today." That was their answer. Not no. Just avoidance. I stood there for a few seconds that felt like a long time. Then I nodded slowly. "Well," I said quietly, "I won't cause a scene." I handed the wrapped gift to my mother. "Give this to them." She took it awkwardly. And just like that, I turned around and walked back toward the parking lot. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I reached my car. I sat behind the wheel for a while before starting the engine. Not crying. Just thinking. Sometimes the deepest kind of hurt isn't loud. It's quiet. It's realizing that somewhere along the way you stopped belonging. The next morning I packed my bag and drove back to North Carolina. I didn't call anyone. And no one called me. Until 3 days later. When the wedding planner asked how I planned to pay $26,000 for a wedding, I had never even been allowed to attend. And suddenly the story wasn't over after all. The moment the planner told me my name was listed as the financial guarantor, something inside me went very still. Not angry. Not shocked. Just quiet. At 62, you learn that when something doesn't make sense, the smartest thing to do is slow down and listen carefully before reacting. "Ma'am," I said gently into the phone, "could you explain exactly what you mean by that?" The woman on the other end, Claire, she had said her name, sounded relieved that I wasn't yelling. "Well, she began carefully. When the reception contract was finalized, your brother indicated that you would be covering the balance as a wedding gift. Your name and contact information were listed as the responsible party." I leaned back in my kitchen chair. "My brother told you that?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you never spoke with me?" There was a pause. "Well, no." I took another slow breath. "Claire, I need you to understand something," I said calmly. "I wasn't even allowed into that wedding." Silence filled the line. "I'm sorry. What?" "I drove 8 hours to attend," I explained quietly. "My parents stopped me at the door and told me I wasn't invited." Claire didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then she spoke again, her voice noticeably more cautious. "That was not the impression we were given." I could imagine her flipping through paperwork, looking at the contract again. "Would it be possible," she asked carefully, "for me to email you the documentation we have on file?" "That would be very helpful," I said. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring out the kitchen window at the maple tree in my backyard. The leaves were just beginning to change color. Fall always reminds me how quietly things can shift. One moment everything looks normal. Then suddenly the whole landscape changes. About 20 minutes later the email arrived. I opened it slowly. There were several attachments. Invoices, receipts, and the reception contract. I clicked on the contract first. Sure enough, near the bottom of the document was a section labeled Financial Guarantor. And right there in neat typed letters was my name. Margaret Hayes. Below it was my phone number. My email address. Everything correct. Except for one very important detail. The signature line beneath my name. I stared at it for a moment. It wasn't my handwriting. Not even close. Someone had signed my name. Clumsily. Like a person copying a signature they'd only seen a few times. I leaned back again and rubbed my temples. "Well," I murmured to the empty kitchen, "that explains a few things." For a few minutes I felt the familiar pull of anger rising in my chest. But anger has never served me well. 25 years in the Navy teaches you that reacting too quickly rarely solves anything. So instead I started reading. The contract showed the reception had been held in the vineyard's renovated barn hall. Dinner for 140 guests. Open bar. Live band. Late-night dessert buffet. The total cost had come to just over $31,000. Daniel and his fiancée had paid $5,000 as a deposit, leaving $26,000 still outstanding. And apparently they had decided that I was the person who would quietly cover the rest. I couldn't help but shake my head a little. Not because of the money. I've been careful with my finances my whole life. A retired Navy pension and a modest savings account have kept me comfortable enough. $26,000 would certainly hurt. But it wouldn't destroy me. What hurt was the assumption. The idea that they believed I would simply accept it. Pay the bill. And keep quiet about the rest. My phone buzzed softly on the table. Another email from Claire. This one included the email thread between the wedding planner and my brother. I opened it. The first message was from Daniel. "Hi, Claire. Just confirming that my sister Margaret will be covering the remaining balance as our wedding gift. She's flying in from North Carolina for the ceremony, so you can contact her directly if needed." Below that was Claire's response thanking him for the clarification. Then another message from Daniel. "She'll probably want the invoice sent after the wedding so it doesn't ruin the surprise." I sat there reading those words twice, then a third time. Finally, I closed the laptop. For a moment, I just listened to the quiet house around me. The hum of the refrigerator. A dog barking somewhere down the street. Normal life continuing, completely unaware of the strange little drama unfolding at my kitchen table. The truth was, I wasn't even surprised. Daniel had always had a way of letting other people clean up his messes. When we were kids, if something broke in the house somehow, I ended up being the one apologizing. If he forgot a school project, I was the one helping him finish it the night before. Our parents called it being the responsible one. But responsibility can become a trap if you're not careful. People start assuming you'll carry burdens that were never yours. My phone rang again around noon. This time it was Daniel. I watched the screen light up with his name. For a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something told me I should answer. "Hello, Daniel." His voice sounded tense. "Margaret, what did you say to the wedding venue?" I smiled faintly. "Hello to you too." "This isn't funny," he snapped. "They're saying you refused to pay the bill." "I didn't refuse anything," I said calmly. I simply explained that I never agreed to it. There was a long pause. "You were supposed to help out," he said finally. "Help out," I repeated gently. "With the reception." "Daniel," I said quietly, "you told the venue I would pay $26,000. You can afford it." That sentence sat between us like a stone. "You didn't invite me to the wedding," I reminded him. "That was Mom's decision." "Yet you were perfectly comfortable putting my name on the bill." He sighed loudly into the phone. "You're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be." For the first time, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Something steadier. "No," I said softly. "I think you already made it exactly as big as it needed to be." He didn't have an answer for that. And as the silence stretched between us, I realized something important. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to rush in and fix Daniel's problems. This time, the responsibility was going to land exactly where it belonged. Claire called me again the next morning. Her voice was gentler this time, almost cautious, like someone stepping carefully across thin ice. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, "our accounting department asked me to follow up with you regarding the reception contract." I had already poured my morning coffee and settled into the same kitchen chair where I'd read the paperwork the day before. "I figured they might," I replied. There was a brief pause. "After reviewing the documentation you sent," Claire continued, "it does appear the signature on the guarantor line may not have been signed by you." "May not have," I said mildly. Well, she admitted it's clearly inconsistent. I appreciated her professionalism. She was trying to stay neutral while also acknowledging the obvious. "I've never signed that document," I said calmly, "and I never agreed to pay for my brother's wedding." "I understand," she replied. "Our legal department just needs a written statement confirming that." "That won't be a problem." We talked a little longer about the process. Claire explained that once my statement was submitted, the venue would reassess who was legally responsible for the remaining balance. Before we hung up, she hesitated. "Mrs. Hayes, if you don't mind me asking, did your family really tell you that you weren't invited?" Her question caught me off guard. I looked out the window again at the quiet street. "Yes," I said simply, "they did." "I'm very sorry," she said. And the sincerity in her voice surprised me. After we ended the call, I typed the statement they requested. It was straightforward, just a few paragraphs confirming I had never agreed to serve as financial guarantor, and that the signature on the contract was not mine. I emailed it back within the hour. Then I closed my laptop and went about my day. That afternoon, I drove to the Veterans Center like I always did on Tuesdays. The building itself isn't fancy. Just an old brick office complex near the VA hospital where a handful of us volunteers help veterans sort through paperwork, benefits forms, appointment scheduling, things like that. A lot of the folks who come through those doors are older men who served decades ago and never quite figured out the system. Sometimes they just need someone patient enough to sit down with them and read the fine print. I've always found comfort in that kind of work. Problems that can actually be solved. Real conversations. Nothing like the strange mess waiting back home in my email inbox. When I arrived, my friend Harold was already at his usual desk. Harold is 73 and served 2 tours in Vietnam. He's been volunteering there even longer than I have. He looked up as I walked in. "Well, if it isn't Margaret Hayes," he said with a grin. "Thought you were off celebrating a wedding." I hung my jacket on the back of my chair. Plans changed, I said. Harold studied my face for a moment. You okay? That's the thing about people who've lived long enough. They recognize when something's off. I poured myself a cup of the center's terrible coffee and sat down across from him. Let me ask you something, I said. Shoot. If someone tries to hand you a $26,000 bill for something you didn't agree to, what would you do? Harold raised an eyebrow. Well, he said slowly, first I'd make sure they had the wrong Margaret Hayes. I chuckled quietly. That was my first thought, too. Then I explained the whole story. The wedding. The vineyard. My parents stopping me at the door. The contract with my forged signature. Harold listened without interrupting, leaning back in his chair. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. That's something he said. That's one way to put it. He shook his head slowly. You gonna pay it? Number. The answer came out so easily it surprised me. Harold nodded once approving. Good. I looked at him curiously. No lecture about family loyalty. He smiled faintly. Margaret, I've lived long enough to learn something about family. Oh. Blood might make you related, he said, but respect is what makes you family. His words stayed with me the rest of the afternoon. Because deep down that was exactly what this situation had always been about. Not money. Respect. Or rather the lack of it. When I got home that evening, there was another email waiting for me. This one wasn't from Claire. It was from Daniel. The subject line simply read, "We need to talk." I opened it. Margaret, the venue says you told them you're not responsible for the bill. This is causing a huge problem for us. Mom and Dad are really upset. You know they can't afford something like this. Can we please figure something out? I read the message twice. Then I leaned back in my chair. What struck me most wasn't the request. It was the tone. Daniel wasn't apologizing. He wasn't acknowledging what had happened at the wedding. He was simply asking me to solve the problem, the same way I always had. I stared at the blinking cursor for a moment before typing my reply. Daniel, you told the venue I would pay for a wedding I wasn't invited to. I did not sign that contract. I am not responsible for that bill. Margaret. Short. Clear. Honest. I hit send. About 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Daniel. It was my father. I watched the screen for a few seconds before answering. Hello, Dad. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Margaret, he said quietly. We need to talk. And somehow I had the feeling this conversation was going to reveal more than anyone in my family had expected. My father had never been a man who wasted words. When I was a kid, his advice usually came in short sentences that sounded more like instructions than conversations. Things like finish what you start, or stand by your decisions. So when he said, Margaret, we need to talk, I knew the conversation wouldn't be small. I set my phone on speaker and sat back at the kitchen table. All right, I said calmly, what would you like to talk about? There was a long pause on the line. I could hear the faint background noise of a television somewhere behind him. Probably the same living room where Daniel and I had grown up. Finally, he cleared his throat. The vineyard called your mother this morning. I imagine they did. They said you told them you're not responsible for the bill. That's correct. Another pause followed. Then he said something that almost made me laugh. Well, we thought you would help. Not apologize. Not explain. Just that quiet assumption again. I folded my hands together on the table. Dad, I said gently, I drove 8 hours to attend Daniel's wedding. I know. You and Mom stopped me at the door. That was a misunderstanding. I leaned back in my chair. A misunderstanding, I repeated. Well, he said, slowly choosing his words carefully, Daniel's fiancé wanted to keep the guest list small. 140 people is small now. He didn't answer. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. Then he said something that revealed more than he probably meant to. Margaret, we didn't think you'd actually come. That sentence hung in the air between us. I stared at the kitchen wall for a moment. You didn't think I'd come to my own brother's wedding. You've been distant for years. I've been living my life. Exactly. There it was. That quiet judgment I'd heard since I was 18. The moment I chose the Navy instead of staying in Ohio. The moment I decided I didn't need anyone's permission to build my own life. I'm not sure how that explains forging my signature on a contract, I said calmly. This time the silence lasted longer. Finally he said quietly, your mother handled the paperwork. Of course she did. Mom had always believed she was good at solving problems, even if the solutions created bigger ones later. Did Daniel know, I asked? He knew we were asking you to help. That's not what I asked. He didn't answer. And that was answer enough. I closed my eyes briefly and exhaled through my nose. You put my name on a $26,000 contract without asking me, I said. You can afford it. It was the same sentence Daniel had used. Exactly the same. For a moment I almost admired the consistency. Dad, I said gently, this isn't about whether I can afford it. Well, it certainly isn't about whether we can. I could hear the frustration creeping into his voice now. Your mother and I are retired, Margaret. We don't have that kind of money. I understand that. Then you see the problem. Yes, I said. I do. The problem was that for 62 years my family had believed one thing about me. That eventually I would step in and carry whatever burden they placed on my shoulders. And the truth was, they weren't wrong. I had done it my entire life. But something about standing in that gravel parking lot outside the vineyard had shifted something deep inside me. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was dignity. Maybe it was simply exhaustion. I'm not paying that bill, I said quietly. My father let out a long breath. You're really going to let your brother start his marriage buried in debt? I thought about that question carefully. Then I answered honestly. Number. What does that mean? It means Daniel started his marriage by lying. Another long silence. This one heavier than the others. Finally, my father spoke again. You've always been stubborn. I smiled faintly. You used to call it responsibility. Well, sometimes responsibility means helping family. And sometimes, I said gently, it means teaching them not to make the same mistake again. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I hadn't expected. Your mother is very upset. I'm sure she is. She says you're humiliating the family. That almost made me laugh out loud. Dad? I said quietly. They told a wedding venue that I would pay for a reception I wasn't even allowed to attend. Yes, but that was supposed to stay private. I shook my head slowly. And that was when it became perfectly clear. This had never been about right or wrong. It had been about appearances. Saving face. Avoiding embarrassment. And they had assumed the easiest solution was to quietly hand the problem to me. Well, I said calmly, it isn't private anymore. What are you planning to do? Nothing dramatic. Margaret. The venue asked for a written statement confirming that I didn't authorize the contract, I explained. And you gave it to them. Yes. So what happens now? I glanced over at the email Claire had sent earlier that afternoon. They'll assign the responsibility back to the people who signed the agreement. My father didn't speak for several seconds. Then he asked the question I knew had been coming. That means Daniel. Yes. Another long silence. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded older than ever. You've changed. I thought about that. No, I said softly. I think I've just finally stopped carrying things that were never mine to carry. The next week was strangely quiet. No angry phone calls, no dramatic messages. Just silence. And at my age, I've learned that silence usually means one of two things. Either people are calming down, or they're figuring out what to do next. For my part, I went back to living my life. On Wednesday morning, I drove to the grocery store like I always did. Same small market 2 miles from my house. Same cashier who's worked there for years. Morning, Margaret, she said as she scanned my bread and eggs. Morning, Susan. Outside, the weather had turned crisp. That kind of early autumn air that reminds you summer is officially over. Simple things. Normal things. But beneath that calm routine, I knew something else was happening back in Ohio. Because when a venue doesn't get paid, they don't simply shrug and forget about it. They follow up. And they follow up seriously. 3 days later, Claire called again. Mrs. Hayes, I wanted to update you on the situation. I set my coffee down and listened. Our legal department reviewed the statement you sent along with the contract documentation. That sounds thorough, I said. It is. She paused briefly. Because the signature on the guarantor line cannot be verified as yours, the venue cannot legally hold you responsible for the balance. That makes sense. However, she continued carefully, the contract was still executed by the primary clients, your brother and his fiancée. So the responsibility shifts back to them. Yes. I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see me. And have they been notified? Yes, ma'am. Another small pause. Your brother seemed surprised. I almost smiled. Well, I said gently, that makes two of us. Claire chuckled softly. I'll admit this situation is unusual. I imagine it doesn't happen often. Not exactly like this. She hesitated again before speaking. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you handled the situation with remarkable calm. I thought about that. Years in the Navy, I said. You learn that reacting emotionally usually makes problems worse. Well, she said kindly, for what it's worth, I think you handled yourself with a great deal of dignity. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. It wasn't a victory exactly. More like the settling of a balance that had been off for a long time. That evening my phone rang again. Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello? His voice came through tight and sharp. They reassigned the bill to me. Yes. You did this. No, I said calmly, you did. You could have helped. I could have been invited. That stopped him. You're really going to keep bringing that up? It seems relevant. He exhaled loudly. You don't understand how embarrassing this is. I leaned back in my chair. Daniel, you told a business that I would pay $26,000 without asking me. It was supposed to be a gift. A gift requires consent. Another pause. You always make things complicated. That sentence sounded so familiar it almost made me nostalgic. Actually, I said quietly, this is the first time I've kept things very simple. How do you figure that? You signed the contract. And now you're responsible for it. That's not fair. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Fair. Yes. You told the venue I was paying. You're my sister. That's true. Families help each other. Yes, I said. They also invite each other to weddings. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel said something softer. You really would have paid, wouldn't you? That question caught me off guard. I thought about it honestly. Yes, I said. If you had asked. He didn't respond immediately. And when he finally spoke, his voice sounded different. Less angry. Mom said you caused a scene at the venue. I didn't. She said you embarrassed her. I handed her a gift and left quietly. Another long silence followed. Then Daniel sighed. Things got out of hand. They did. We were under a lot of pressure planning the wedding. I'm sure. And Mom thought, well, she thought I'd cover the bill. Yeah. There it was. Finally spoken out loud. I rubbed my forehead slowly. Daniel, do you know what hurt the most? What? Not the money. Then what? The assumption that I'd accept being treated that way. He didn't answer. And for the first time since all of this began, the anger seemed to drain out of the conversation. What happens now? He asked quietly. That's up to you. You mean the bill? Yes. I don't have $26,000. I know. So what am I supposed to do? I thought about that for a moment. Then I gave him the only honest answer I had. The same thing most adults do when they face a debt. And that is, you figure it out. The line stayed silent for several seconds. Then Daniel spoke again, but this time his voice carried something new. Something I hadn't heard from him in a long time. Uncertainty. Margaret? Yes. Did we really hurt you that badly? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked out the window at the fading evening light. Yes, I said softly. You did. And for the first time since the wedding, Daniel didn't argue. Daniel didn't call again for nearly 2 weeks. In younger years, that kind of silence might have bothered me. I might have spent hours wondering what people were thinking or whether I should call first and smooth things over. But age changes your perspective. When you reach your 60s, you begin to understand that not every silence needs to be filled. Sometimes people need space to sit with the consequences of their own choices. So I went on with my routine. The leaves in my neighborhood had turned deeper shades of orange and red. My morning walks were cooler now, and the air carried that dry, earthy smell that always reminds me of fall in Ohio when I was a child. One Thursday afternoon, I was finishing up a stack of paperwork at the Veterans Center when my phone buzzed in my purse. I glanced at the screen. It was my father again. I excused myself from the desk and stepped outside into the small parking lot behind the building before answering. "Hello, Dad." For a moment all I heard was the wind moving through the trees on his end of the line. Then he spoke. "Margaret, do you have a few minutes?" "I do." His voice sounded slower than usual, like someone choosing each word carefully. "Your mother and I met with Daniel yesterday." I leaned against my car door. "And they're working out a payment plan with the vineyard." That didn't surprise me. Most venues will negotiate once they realize someone genuinely intends to pay, even if it takes time. "That sounds reasonable," I said. "Yes." There was a long pause. Then he added quietly, "It's going to take them several years." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I watched a pair of older men slowly crossing the parking lot toward the building, laughing about something I couldn't hear. Life moving forward as usual. "You didn't call to update me on the payment plan," I said gently. "Number." Another pause. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. "Your mother wants to apologize." I blinked. "I see. She knows she handled things poorly." That was one way to put it. "And Daniel?" I asked. "He's embarrassed." That might be a healthy experience. My father chuckled quietly. "You always did have a way of putting things plainly. That comes with practice." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "You know, when you joined the Navy, your mother thought you were running away." "Running away from what?" "From us." I leaned my head back against the car window and looked up at the sky. "That wasn't it," I said softly. "What was it then?" "I was building a life." He considered that. "I suppose we never quite understood that." "I know." He sighed. "When Daniel was younger, he needed more help. Your mother and I worried about him constantly." "I remember. You seemed so capable." That old explanation again. The responsible child. The strong one. The one who didn't need support. "Capable people still need respect," I said quietly. "I see that now." Another pause followed. Then my father said something that made my chest tighten a little. "Your mother cried after the wedding." I wasn't sure what to do with that information. "Why?" "She said she realized too late that she'd pushed you away." I took a slow breath. It's strange how hearing something like that can soften anger you didn't even realize you were still holding. "I never wanted distance," I said. "I just wanted to be treated like I mattered." "You did matter." "Then why did it take 60 years to hear that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he asked something else. "Would you consider coming to Ohio for Thanksgiving this year?" The question surprised me. My parents had never been the type to openly invite difficult conversations. But maybe time changes people. Just like it changes everything else. "I'd have to think about it," I said honestly. "That's fair." "And Dad?" "Yes." "If I come, it won't be to pretend none of this happened." "I wouldn't expect that." I nodded slowly. For the first time since the vineyard parking lot, I felt something inside my chest loosen. Not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of it. Before we hung up, my father said one more thing. "Margaret." "Yes." "You handled this better than I would have." I smiled faintly. "That comes with experience." And when the call ended, I stood there for a moment in the quiet parking lot, realizing that sometimes the most powerful kind of revenge isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply standing still long enough for the truth to catch up with everyone involved. Thanksgiving arrived with the kind of cold gray sky that always reminds me of Ohio in late November. I hadn't been back to my parents' house in nearly 4 years. The drive north felt different this time, not heavy like the trip to the wedding had been, just thoughtful, quiet. I left Raleigh before sunrise and followed the same highways I'd taken weeks earlier, watching the landscape slowly shift from North Carolina pine forests to the rolling farmland of southern Ohio. 8 hours gives a person plenty of time to think. But strangely enough, my thoughts weren't angry anymore. They were reflective. At some point in your 60s, you start understanding something about life. People carry their mistakes longer than they carry their pride. And sometimes it takes a crisis for families to finally say things they should have said decades earlier. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the sun was already beginning to set. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Funny how that happens? When you're a kid, your childhood home feels enormous. By the time you return later in life, it feels almost modest. My father opened the front door before I even knocked. For a moment we just stood there looking at each other. He had aged since the last time I'd seen him. Not dramatically, but enough that the years were visible now in the lines around his eyes. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, Margaret." Then he stepped aside. "Come in." The house smelled exactly the same as it always had on Thanksgiving. Turkey. Stuffing. And my mother's pumpkin pie. Mom was standing in the kitchen when I walked in. She turned slowly when she heard my footsteps. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she did something that surprised me. She walked straight over and hugged me. Not the polite kind of hug families sometimes exchange. A real one. Tight. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Just 2 words. But after 62 years, they carried weight. When she stepped back, her eyes were wet. "I handled the wedding terribly," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied gently. She nodded. "I thought if we put your name on the contract, you'd help quietly and everything would work out." "That sounds like you." "I didn't realize how much it would hurt you." I looked around the kitchen. Same table. Same cabinets. Same place where so many arguments and conversations had taken place over the years. "I wasn't hurt by the money," I said. "I know that now. I was hurt because you told me I wasn't family." My mother closed her eyes briefly. "That was the worst mistake I've made in a long time." Behind us, Daniel walked into the room. He looked different, too. Not older exactly. Just humbler. His new wife, Emily, stood quietly beside him. Daniel cleared his throat. "Hi, Margaret." "Hi." For a moment, we all stood there awkwardly. Then Emily spoke. "I'm really glad you came." Her voice was kind, sincere. "Thank you," I said. Daniel shifted his weight uncomfortably. "I owe you an apology." "Yes," I said. "I was wrong to put your name on that contract." "Yes." I don't know. I thought you'd cover it and we'd sort it out later. That seems to be the family tradition." He managed a small, embarrassed smile. "We're paying it off," he said. "The vineyard set up a payment plan." I heard. "It's going to take a few years." "That's all right." He looked surprised. "You're not angry?" I considered that question carefully. "I was angry," I said, "but anger has a shelf life." Daniel nodded slowly. "I guess we deserved what happened." "No," I said softly. "You deserve to face the consequences of your choices." Emily spoke again. "In a strange way, it's actually helped us." We all looked at her. She shrugged. "Daniel and I had to sit down and figure out our finances together. Really figure them out." Daniel laughed quietly. "Turns out marriage starts with a lot of spreadsheets." "That's not the worst foundation," I said. Dinner that evening was quieter than Thanksgiving dinners used to be when we were younger. But it was also more honest. We talked about work. About retirement. About Emily's teaching job. About my volunteer work with veterans. And for the first time in years, no one pretended our family was perfect. Later that night, after the dishes were done and everyone else had gone to bed, my father and I sat together in the living room. The same room where he'd watched decades of football games and evening news broadcasts. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I always thought strength meant solving everyone else's problems." I smiled faintly. "A lot of people think that. But watching you these past weeks, I realized something." "What's that?" "Strength can also mean refusing to carry problems that aren't yours." I nodded. "That's something the Navy taught me." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm proud of you, Margaret." The words landed gently but deeply. At 62 years old, hearing that still mattered. More than I would have expected. Before I went to bed that night, I stood by the window of my old childhood bedroom and looked out at the quiet Ohio street. The wedding. The bill. The phone calls. All of it had started as a story about betrayal. But somehow it had turned into something else. A reminder. That respect matters more than money. That honesty matters more than appearances. And that sometimes the best revenge isn't hurting someone back. It's simply standing your ground until the truth brings everyone back to the same table. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, someone who had to learn the hard way to stand up for themselves, I hope you'll share it with them. And if you enjoy stories about real-life family and the lessons that come with time, feel free to subscribe and join us again. Because sometimes the quietest stories carry the deepest truths.